In Japan, a new prime minister prepares for his first state visit to the USA. Trade tensions between the U.S. and Japan are running high.
The type inequities and the type abuses that we have permitted for 30 or 40 years to permit Japan to build their economy back up, those days are over. And now they're going to have to begin to respond as an equal partner and not as a developing nation.
Psychologically, where there's a backlash now, where the Japanese people say, are we that bad? You know, I thought Americans were our friends, you know. They're treating us like enemies, as if we're communists, you know. That's not fair.
Can Japan and the United States avoid a trade war? And what will new leadership in Tokyo mean for the world economy? From Washington, this is American Interests. American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer Inc. and these leading foundations. In our Washington studios, we'll talk with Roger Swanson, Executive Director of the U.S.-Japan Business Council, and William Tanaka, a leading attorney and lobbyist representing Japanese interests in Washington, D.C. We'll join them in a moment. But first, let's look at a new Japanese Prime Minister and the host of trade problems that confront him. On November 6, 1987, an era in U.S.-Japanese relations came to a close. The charismatic Yasu Nakasone, who had led Japan for 5 years, stepped down as prime minister. His successor is Noboru Takeshita. He is 63 years old, the son of a sake brewer from rural western Japan. He entered politics in 1951 at the age of 27. From 1982 to 1986, he served as Japan's finance minister. And in 1987, after months of factional struggle, Takeshita was chosen by Nakasone to head the Liberal Democratic Party and become Japan's new prime minister. Takeshita comes to office at a critical period in U.S.-Japanese relations. 1987 saw the total U.S. trade deficit climb to $175 billion, $50 billion of which is accounted for by Japan. A year ago, the U.S.-Japanese exchange rate had reached a low of 163 yen to the dollar. By December, it slipped to a record low of 135. The falling dollar makes Japanese products relatively more expensive for American consumers and may unleash a round of inflation. Meanwhile, U.S. stocks, bonds, and real estate become even cheaper for Japanese investors. That means that Japanese money is pouring into the United States, money that someday must be paid back.
We're holding a fire sale in America. We're holding a big bargain sale for the Japanese, and a lot of Japanese are taking advantage of it by buying land and companies and other properties in America. That's what the Americans did in Europe in the 1950s and 60s. It's simply a replay, only now it's Japan's turn, and we find it a little uncomfortable.
Over the past 2 years, we heard American leadership say, strong dollar will solve the problem. And it was about 260 yen to the dollar. Recently, they say, cheaper dollar solves the problems. And therefore, they have drove down this value of the dollar as much as 50%. Nothing happens, trade deficit doesn't disappear. So we don't know what is right. 2, 3 years ago, high interest rate of upper teens was tolerated. Nowadays, they say interest must be low, asking Japan and Germany to lower already the lowest interest rate in history, which is 2%, in order to keep this spread between the US and Japan interest rate. Now, what's their point of view? We don't know. But what they have said swung from this end to that end, economy stays the same. So there must be something wrong with what they're saying.
American companies complain that they remain largely locked out of Japan's huge market. They point to the Kansai Airport, now under construction off the coast of Japan, one of the largest infrastructure projects in history. Built entirely on reclaimed land with a 3-mile bridge connecting it to the mainland, Kansai has been declared off-limits to foreign construction firms, which were not even allowed to bid on the project.
Japan says they believe in free trade. Well, of course, they really don't believe in free trade. They believe in controlled trade. For example, can the agriculture from the United States flow into Japan free? Will they accept all the rice that we ship to Japan? As you know, the Japanese farmer is totally protected. Rice costs in Japan 7 times the world market price because they, in effect, protect their market. They are protectionists.
The biggest barrier to penetration, in my view, is impatience. American capital is impatient. The American investor is impatient. We in America take very short-range views of the future many times. Our system drives us in that direction. The Japanese are very patient, long-term investors. American companies that do well in Japan are companies that have been there many, many years. We started there in 1920. And other companies started in that same period of time, and today they have very successful positions in the Japanese market. But you can't put a salesman on an airplane and send him over to get an order and start a business. It just takes a long time.
Prime Minister Nakasone was admired for the way he managed the U.S.-Japanese relationship, diffusing tensions with warm words and occasional concessions to Japan's most important ally. Prime Minister Takeshita is viewed as a consensus builder. He has promised what he calls reliable diplomacy. Fewer words, perhaps, but a better follow-through.
Welcome to American Interests. I'm Morton Kondracki. Mr. Tanaka, do you sense that there is a crisis coming in U.S.-Japan relations? There are polls, for example, that indicate that 55% of the Japanese people believe that relations between the two countries are unfriendly.
Indeed, the indicators are that the United States and Japan are on a collision course. However, it appears that the trade figures are reversing itself. Japanese imports, for example, in November, increased by a factor of 40% over November 1986.
That is Japanese imports from the United States?
Japanese imports worldwide. Mm-hmm. Now, in the case of the United States, I think beyond the question of foreign exporters moving into this market, there is, I think, a fundamental propensity in the economy to rely on imports. For example, 46% of total imports into the United States were accounted for by U.S. multinational corporations. Mm-hmm. You see, so that it's not necessarily a question of whether or not the foreign exporters are aggressively taking over this market.
I see. I take it what you're saying is, in other words, that American companies manufacturing their goods abroad are returning them to the United States, and that accounts for almost half of all exports. Therefore, we shouldn't get mad at Japan.
Precisely.
Okay. What do you say about that, Dr. Smith?
Well, first, the crisis isn't coming. I think the crisis is here. And in terms of dollar figures, in fact, the bilateral trade deficit, U.S. deficit with Japan, will be $1 billion more than last year. We're looking at $60 billion figure. I think there will be a reduction in Japan's overall trade surplus, again in dollar terms. But what concerns me is projecting out the bilateral relationship. You're going to get maybe $2, $3, $4, $5 billion decrease, but you're still in the $60 billion range. That's politically and economically unsustainable.
Now, again, the amount of the Japan surplus with the United States is going to increase or decrease?
It will increase $1 billion, we think, for 1987.
Okay, now I thought that because the dollar was going to fall, that therefore we would import less from Japan, and they would be able to buy more American products because they're cheaper, and therefore the trade deficit, our trade deficit would go down. Why isn't that happening?
That's what we thought, and we're still waiting, and that suggests that there might be some market access problems in Japan.
Market access problems, that is protectionism in Japan.
Right, tariff and non-tariff.
Now, how do you answer this? I mean, he says it's getting worse.
Well, first of all, this year, I think with the dollar falling very rapidly, I think there is hedge buying, which will raise total imports in this country, particularly from Japan. So that I think that this year's increases will not necessarily reflect the longer-term trend, which is a decline.
Why do you say that 1988 or maybe 1989 this problem will be behind us? What are the factors? If it's not going to work for 87, why will it work next year or the year
after? I think that fundamentally Japan has turned its economy around toward a domestic demand-driven economy from an export-oriented economy. But this takes a considerable amount of time before it will reflect itself substantially in trade statistics. But nevertheless...
Do you see evidence of that?
Longer term, yes, but by longer term, we'll all be dead. Let me give you an example. Last year, in '86, U.S. exported 2,345 cars to Japan. 2,345. Japan exported 2.3 million cars to the U.S. Doesn't anybody in Japan care? I mean,
does anybody in Japan? No, wait. Does anybody in Japan want an American car? And do we make right-hand drive cars for them?
Okay, that's nonsense. Last year, Japan exported 4.5 million cars globally and imported 68,000 cars, including Volvos, BMWs, Mercedes, and so on. It's got a hollow ring. There's a problem here.
Now, the charge is that Japan is fundamentally protectionist. You could make a perfect car with the best right-hand drive, and Japanese wouldn't buy them. What do you say about that?
I don't think that's true. I don't think that the major manufacturers in the United States have really made an effort to develop the Japanese market. And certainly the fact that they don't make a right-hand steering car is an indication of that. But more importantly, I think we ought to look to the fact that, that in terms of U.S. imports of cars, that it's the big three U.S. manufacturers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, which would account for approximately 30% of total car imports in this market. They are captive imports, accounted for by U.S. producers. So here's again, there's a propensity to import.
Okay, but what do you say?
States.
What do you say about the Kansai Airport project, where only $1.5 million in a multi-billion-dollar project is going to be built by foreign manufacturers? What kind of fair trade is that, or free trade, I should say?
Indeed, the Kansai Airport problem is a serious problem. However, I think that one of the problems there is the fact that many of the American construction engineering firms have not obtained a general construction license to bid on the project. Now, many of the manufacturers who have received what is a general contractor license are not in the field of construction engineering of that type. You see, so that there is only one major construction engineering firm that has a general license, and therefore
look at the figures.
Therefore have the license to bid.
Dr. Swanson.
Last year, Japanese construction companies did $2.3 billion worth of business in the U.S. The U.S. did 1.3 or 4 million in Japan. There are $60 billion worth of public works projects for the rest of this decade. And it's not just Kansai, it's Tokyo Bay Bridge and throughout Japan. Japanese government's position now is that Japan will not open up to foreign bidding, not just U.S., anything beyond Kansai and Tokyo Bay. So you've got $50 billion of possible projects. Meanwhile, Japanese business or construction firms are working in the U.S. Again,
the question is, I mean, this does raise the fundamental question of whether Japan believes in free trade as capitalists understand it. You know, that is to say that everybody's market is open to everybody else more or less, and that anybody is subject to bid. Now, it looks as though either culturally or for political reasons, Japan doesn't play by those rules.
Indeed, this appears to be the case, but I think that the future participation in Tokyo Bridge construction and other publicly financed projects are not a closed matter at all. And it seems to me that Prime Minister Takeshita, with the support, who has the largest political base of any faction in the Democratic Liberal Party, would be in a good position to re-examine this issue and move in the direction of opening up the markets for publicly financed projects.
Well, let's talk a little bit about him. Is Prime Minister Takeshita, who used to be finance minister, known as a free trader or somebody who believes in increasing the amount that Japan buys from the rest of the world?
He's very well known in Japan, but he doesn't have much of a reputation on these trade issues. He is a consensus player par excellence in the Japanese tradition. So we really don't have a feeling. He's going to reflect prevailing interests, but he's very, very astute at molding these interests and directions. I think of Takeshita as sort of a Lyndon Johnson wheeler-dealer, but without the ego. And Nakasone was sort of a Nixon, you know, go with the wind thing, but without the Watergate. I mean,
now,
we've got a wheeler-dealer.
But Prime Minister Nakasone seemed to be America's friend, that is Reagan's friend. Did he, and he promised a lot in the way of improvements, did he deliver on those improvements?
Well, Japan's current account surplus increased 12-fold.
That is to say,
5 years.
That is to say, they sold more to us and didn't buy any more as a result. Well, do you think that Prime Minister Takeshita is inclined to be more open to foreign products than Prime Minister Nakasone was?
Well, I think that Prime Minister Takeshita is in a better position to push through trade liberalization measures than was Mr. Nakasone. Obviously, Mr. Nakasone represented one of the smaller factions, and therefore his political base was limited. And so the commitments he made could not be implemented as rapidly as we might have expected.
Well, but beyond the trade issue, there are other issues of difference between the United States and Japan, and a lot of its other trading partners who are raising questions about the foreign aid and defense spending that Japan undergoes. We'll come back to that in just a second.
In downtown Tokyo, the evidence of Japanese prosperity is everywhere. The average per capita income is now about $17,000 a year, $1,000 more than in the United States. But inside Japan, some argue that the benefits of Japan's economic success are not shared equally.
Japanese consumers have saved very assiduously. They pay the highest food prices in the world, or highest food costs of any product if you come to that, for a very simple reason. All the benefits are being channeled into manufacturing. We have a super efficient manufacturing industry who benefits from consumer saving. We have an inefficient distribution industry employing about the same number of people in the United States with half the population. So on simple calculation, it's only half as efficient. We have farm products that are costing a multiple from 2 to 10 times more than other countries, many other countries. So who's supporting that? The consumer, of course. And who's benefiting from that? The manufacturing business, of course. It's got to come from somewhere. So that's your answer. The consumer is badly off here.
Outside the country, voices are calling for the Japanese to shoulder a greater responsibility in maintaining the world economy. Japanese banks have been asked to increase their lending to debt-ridden third world countries, and the government has been called on to drop trade barriers to third world products.
We all recognize that the third world needs to have exports in order to pay debts and so forth that they have incurred. If you take the merchandise, products shipped from third world countries, take all of their exports, the United States imports 60% of those products. Europe imports 22%, and Japan imports 8%.
Japan's military posture has come under fire as well. Japan spends around 1% of its GNP on a modest but efficient defense force. The Constitution prohibits building a larger army or deploying existing forces outside of Japan's immediate surroundings. When Western nations moved naval forces into the Persian Gulf, an effort that includes some 30 American vessels, the Japanese were conspicuously absent, despite the fact that 55% of their oil comes from the region. Meanwhile, a budget-conscious America is beginning to question why 60,000 U.S. troops are stationed in Japan at an annual cost to U.S. taxpayers of $2.6 billion. The question facing policymakers on both sides of the Pacific is whether Japan can remain a great economic power without assuming parallel responsibilities in military and political affairs.
Dr. Swanson, what should we do about this? Should we want Japan to become a fully armed nation spending 6% of its GNP on defense, or what's the alternative?
No, two things. One, Japan should do what it's doing now, and that's recycling its current account surplus to lesser developed nations. Secondly, Japan should cooperate with some of the industrialized nations in terms of the embargoes on South Africa, Vietnam, Iran, and so on. Japan has now replaced the U.S. as South Africa's major trading partner.
Well, now, wait a minute. Should not that be politically relevant in this country? If Japan is going around the West's embargoes of the South African apartheid regime, should they not be punished somehow in trade legislation in the United States?
On Vietnam, in the defense appropriations bill, there's a rider critiquing Japan because its trade with Vietnam has increased by $250 million since 1982. Initially, Japan was reluctant to join U.S. in the Iran embargo. What I'm saying is you've got a whole complex of security issues beyond just defense spending. I think it's a wrong route to go to say you've got to increase your GNP defense spending.
Well, I mean, which side is Japan on in matters like this? I mean, they are being defended by the United States at our expense. We're spending research and development money to help defend Japan. Japan is trading with Vietnam and South Africa.
Yes, well, Japan, up until recently, has had an export-oriented economy. And in order to maximize exports, Japan has separated its political objectives in the foreign economic policy area from its commercial objectives. And this has resulted in Japan shipping to the extent possible consistent with, for example, co-communists and so on, exports to the Eastern Bloc countries and so on. But this, as I say, is changing gradually, not necessarily, the pace does not necessarily satisfy the U.S. Congress, but nevertheless, it is changing toward a domestically driven economy, which means gradual cutbacks in export endeavors and an increase in imports. And this is the only way in which I think Japanese export policies will realign itself with broader U.S. national interests.
Mm-hmm. But you know, there's a different level here. You're saying that it was commercialism, in effect, that drove Japan to sell to absolutely anybody, and now that they're going to become more of a domestically oriented economy, they'll stop selling so much to anybody else. Where is the ethical and sort of team spirit here? If they're part of the West, culturally and economically, why don't they behave that way?
You forget the fact that Japan is not an bountifully endowed country, natural resource-wise or energy resource-wise, and therefore Japan has had a constant fear of not being able to import its food supply, its energy sources, energy supply, and so on abroad, unless it maintained a strong export position. And this is what has resulted in the economic recovery of Japan. Now, as I say, Japan now sees that this is simply asynchronous in relation to the rest of the world, and it is trying very desperately to bring the Japanese economy's spin back into its synchronous position with the rest of the world. But this takes time, because you're dealing with a major free world economy. And it's like trying to turn a super tanker around and change its direction. It takes time.
Well, do you think it is turning around?
I think it is, slowly, but too slowly. And Japan's an economic superpower that's acting like a developing country. You know, it's the largest creditor nation in the history of the world. We're now the largest debtor nation.
Well, are there...
This carries responsibilities.
Yeah, but are there measures that we could apply to Japan so that we could say, year by year, whether they are indeed bearing their fair share? And where are they at the moment?
Well, I think on developmental assistance side, Japan is doing a very good job. There are some problems with tied aid and so on.
It's a 0.25% of GNP, I believe, in foreign aid, right? Which is about the same as ours.
That's right.
But shouldn't they be spending a lot more if they're spending a lot more?
Yeah, they've announced a recycling plan and so on. On the developmental assistance side, I think Japan is doing a good job. What concerns me is the mix between security, developmental assistance, sort of open markets and so on. You don't have a consistent pattern of a nation acting as it should, given its economic clout. You know, that responsibilities come with this clout.
Okay, as we look forward, if Japan is going to be this economic superpower, it has always happened that with economic power comes political power. In other words, it's going to be one of the main players at the table, and in negotiations with such a power, one would guess that the creditor will have the advantage. Now, are we going to be in a position to get Japan to do the kinds of things that we would like to see it do when they're the creditor and we're the debtor?
The point is Japan should be doing certain things like increasing imports, not because the U.S. is asking to do it, but because it's good for Japan. And I'm sure Mr. Tanaka will agree.
This
whole thing is out of whack.
It's out of whack.
Does Takeshita think it's out of whack?
Certainly every statement he's made indicates that he feels that it's out of whack. I think that we can do a lot by trying to coordinate our foreign economic aid program with that of the Japanese. For example, in terms of U.S. exports, one of our principal markets happens to be Latin America, but because they're burdened with debt service costs, they're unable to accept more of our exports. Japan could certainly coordinate its foreign aid program with our foreign aid program to encourage economic recovery in Latin American countries, which in turn will increase U.S. exports.
Well, is there any evidence that Japan is going to be the reserve banker for Latin America, the debt reliever?
Yes, in a sense, already I think Takeshita's announced a $2 billion foreign aid program at the last ASEAN conference held in Manila. And that is certainly an indicator of where Takeshita is going with the surplus that Japan has obtained as a result of its exports.
Okay, let me just ask one more trade-connected item. Many American businessmen allege that what Japan does is to target American markets and employ unfair trade practices in the process. Do you give that any credence, or is that just crying wolf?
No, no, I don't think it's crying wolf. There's a history of that, but that is not very much the case now. We saw it in the case of TV, black and white, then color TV, and so on. But now Japan business has been too aggressive and too predatory in terms of being concerned about market share, dominant market share, driving out competitors. I do see a change in Japan on the part of Japanese business now, where that is less the case. But so we've got a lag.
And do you agree with, briefly, do you agree with Mr. Tanaka that Japan is going to become more domestic economy oriented and therefore less export?
Absolutely, that's already happened. Japan now statistically is not export driven. This is quite correct.
So if we wait and we continue doing the things that we were doing, we can avoid a crisis. You think?
Wait. We've been running a deficit with Japan, a trade deficit, since 1972. That's 15 years. We've been told by our Japanese counterparts, wait, be patient.
Yeah.
That's 15 years.
Fine. Thanks very much. We're out of time. Dr. Swanson, Mr. Tanaka, thanks very much for being with us. And for American Interests, this is Morton Kondracki.
American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer Inc. and these leading